British Rail today seems to be a faceless organisation with efficient diesel and electric trains running throughout its system. It's far removed from the glamour and excitement of the steam age, and it hardly seems possible that British Rail ever built steam engines. However, it did, 999 of them. This is just one of them, and this is the story of them in express passenger use, both when they work for a living and today as living relics of a golden age. The very first British Railways built locomotives were extensions of the design practices of its four constituent parts: the Great Western, Southern, London Midland and Scottish, and London and North Eastern Railways. Not until 1951, 3 years after nationalisation, was it possible to produce a new British Railways design locomotive. In that year, the first Pacifics of the British Railways Standard Class 7 were built, rather less prosaically known as Britannias, after the pioneer locomotive which remains today, as we'll see later. We start with Mercury at Crewe. The engines were designed to work on all regions of British Railways and were all built at Crewe. The famous railway town became the main junction for electric traction at the end of steam, and many locomotives were banned from running under the wires south of here, a ban which still applies today, although Mercury appears to be an exception. She's next seen at Andover on the southern region. Although the class and all standard designs was intended for use on any region, the Southern didn't initially have an allocation, since it was oversupplied with Pacifics already, as it had 130 bullied design locomotives, many of which could be seen working short two-coach trains on branches in the southwest. However, in the post-war era, and in the new dawn of the second half of the 20th century, Britain was putting on a brave face for the world, and the new locomotive type, displayed at the Festival of Britain in 1951, just had to appear on the Golden Arrow, the most public of trains which ran from London to Dover. The Golden Arrow resulted in the southern region receiving two engines from the first batch of Britannias, numbers 70004 and number 70014, which were kept at Stuart's Lane in Battersea, always in immaculate condition, as they were so much in the public eye. This didn't last long, although they were joined by a third engine for a short while. They were also used on Bournemouth line trains, most notably the Bournemouth Belle, and Mercury brought back memories as she toured the southern lines on the 8th of February 1964. By this time, she was resident on the London Midland region, having originally been allocated to the Western region, which had named its locomotives in true Great Western tradition, with old GWR names such as Shooting Star, Flying Dutchman, and Arrow, amongst others. The original southern locomotive, always to be remembered as the Golden Arrow engine, was 70004, William Shakespeare, part of a batch named after famous British literary and political characters. Here she makes a nostalgic return to southern metals in the dying days of steam, when she was based on the London Midland region, as was all the class in the 1960s. This was appropriate, as the standard classes were very much a continuation of the locomotive design practice of the old LMS. Robin Riddles was BR's first chief mechanical engineer, although he didn't take that title, preferring instead to be the British Railways board member of the Railway Executive for Mechanical and Electrical Engineering. He'd started his career on the LMS working under Stanier and his successor, H.G. Ivett. The latter's work had been to produce a range of standard designs for the LMS, and it was natural for Riddles, who recruited a cosmopolitan team from all the previous railway administrations, to think along the same lines. In fact, key design posts were allocated to ex-LMS staff, so the BR standards became a natural extension of the LMS design policy. Many of the classes were cosmetically adjusted versions of the final LMS classes, most notably the Class 5 460s, the Class 4 260s and 264 tanks, and the small Class 2 260s and 262 tanks, which were virtually unaltered LMS machines. William Shakespeare exhibits a variation in BR liveries with odd lining. Brunswick green was adopted as the standard express passenger livery for all locomotives, after a short period in the earliest days of nationalization, when the Class 8 express engines were painted blue. By the time the Britannias were introduced, dark Brunswick green was the favored choice, as the blue had not worn well. This was a very little altered version of the old Great Western livery, and it's one of that railway's initial allocation, number 70021 Morning Star, that we see next. This engine with handrails on its smoke deflectors illustrates the original form of the class. This is surprising on a Western engine, as the removal of these was the only major visual alteration that most of the class received during their careers, and it was brought about by an event on the Western region. An accident befell one of the Western Pacifics at Didcot on the 20th of November 1955. Polar Star number 70026 was derailed, and the subsequent inquiry blamed the fact that the driver's view was obscured by the handrails on the deflectors. This was exacerbated by the fact that the Britannias had the standard left-hand driving position, whilst all Great Western engines were right-hand driven, and signals were sighted accordingly. Such is the penalty of standardization. Hereward the Wake illustrates the resultant modification to the smoke deflector handholds, which the London Midland region affected, whilst a classic Great Western Express is seen behind Rising Star, with rather stylish brass-edged handholds. The last Britannia to remain in active service, and the final locomotive to receive a full overhaul at Crewe Works, was 70013 Oliver Cromwell. The great parliamentarian and Britain's first dictator would surely be honoured to know that he's better remembered as a steam engine than his true position in history, at least as far as railway enthusiasts are concerned. The locomotive was a natural choice for end-of-steam rail tours and was substituted for the pioneer Pacific Britannia in the choice of locomotives to form the national collection of museum locomotives. Her immediate predecessor, John o' Gaunt, number 70012, follows. This is another special train run over Western metals from Wolverhampton to Shrewsbury. By this time, the route was in the hands of the Midland region, and number 12 is seen at Wellington Station in Shropshire, formerly a joint Great Western and London North Western station. Seen on the Great Central, number 70054 Dawn at Firth, was the last built of the 55 Class 7 Pacifics. She illustrates the only great visual variation between successive batches, the fitment of a tender with rounded sides, rather than the inset bunker of all those previously seen. This was a BR1D tender fitted to the last 10 engines. All the others were BR1 or BR1A tenders, which were identical in appearance to each other. The same engine is seen on a parcels working on its home region and illustrates the filthy condition in which locomotives ran at the end of the days of steam. The last 5 had originally been allocated to the Scottish region and bore appropriate names. She's something of a contrast to her immaculate sister, Firth of Tay, on the LCGB Special, looking as if she'd just come out of works. The yellow-painted axle block covers on her tender indicate that these were fitted with roller-bearing axles. Finally, we go to Crewe North Locomotive Depot to see another ex-Scottish Britannia, Firth of Clyde, and go inside to see the unique British Railways Class 8P Pacific Duke of Gloucester, whose story is covered in detail later in the programme. For now, we'll look at the express passenger duties of the lower orders of the British Railways standard classes, beginning with the Class 5s on the southern region, which work turn and turn about with that region's native bullied Pacifics. In fact, it has to be said that some drivers preferred them to the Pacifics, and there's no doubt they could run fast. These engines were transferred to the Southern in the last years of steam. but it had received 20 engines straight from the builders in the 1950s. These engines were fitted with the high-sided BR tenders of types BR1F and 1B, as the Southern had no water troughs for picking up water on the move. This was never a problem for the railway, as its longest through working were less than 200 miles to Exeter, and the standards were mainly used on the Bournemouth route of 108 miles. The only standards the Southern never had any allocation of were the 9Fs, although this one is seen on the Bournemouth and Weymouth line at Hamworthy Junction. They were pure freight machines, but this one had just worked over the Somerset and Dorset line, where they had for a number of years worked on such trains as the Pines Express, thus justifying their inclusion herein. And here's the proof. This one is one of the conversions of BR's only real extravagance, the experimental Crosty-boilered 9Fs, converted in the late 1950s to conventional locomotives, albeit with a very unusual outline and no deflectors. We turn back to the pioneer British Railways locomotive class and the pioneer locomotive herself, Britannia, number 70,000. She's seen at Crewe on the occasion of her return to the main line, the highlight of the steam story of 1991. After a prolonged overhaul, which started on the Mean Valley Railway in East Anglia and was completed in early 1991 at Carnforth, the locomotive moved down to Crewe Heritage Centre to prepare for a second mainline career. The test route was from Crewe via Chester to Shrewsbury. We next see her at Chester, where we were able to view her in detail. She's finished in the livery she wore when new in 1951, but has the late pattern of smoke deflectors. This test run wasn't an outstanding success. After Chester, the locomotive's crew noticed a knocking sound following a vigorous assault on Gresford Bank. The engine was eased back and ran through Chirk and Western Ryn at reduced speed. A prolonged stop at Gabowen proved the worst had happened. A big end had become hot, melting the white metal bearing. She clanked away past Bathchurch. At Cotton Hill at Shrewsbury, she was stopped and examined, and one of the most amazing events of the preservation era followed. With the locomotive parked alongside the main line back to Crewe, the support team took her motion down and removed the offending bearing, all done by hand. The second act of the drama followed. The locomotive returned to Crewe working on one cylinder only. Just 2 days later, the locomotive was scheduled to run a rail tour over the same route to Shrewsbury, and the final act of the story was completed. Her bearing had been remetalled and finished overnight. She'd run a second test, and the rail tour took her to Hereford and back, which is where we next see her. After a water stop, she accelerated away again towards Shrewsbury. Two months later, she appeared on the Settle in Carlisle, on a southbound working. Sadly, hot weather had left the mountains dry, and she was held back for fear of setting the isolated countryside ablaze. The prototype and the first built Britannias were initially used on the Great Eastern Main Line in the early 1950s, so Britannia's return to Fen country was eagerly awaited. In October 1991 this took place, with 70,000 working turn and turn about with 34027 Tor Valley and 4472 Flying Scotsman. The second preserved Britannia, 70013 Oliver Cromwell, is also located in East Anglia at Alan Bloom's Bressingham Steam Museum at Diss. Following the Fen Line Gala, Britannia returned to the Nene Valley Railway at Peterborough, where she was to receive winter maintenance. Here we see her at the railway's headquarters, Wansford. The much trumpeted at the time cab layout is seen as we climb on the footplate of BR's first locomotive and ride up the line through the tunnel to Ferry Meadows. The other mainline BR Pacific is more famous in preservation than she was in service. 71,000 Duke of Gloucester is a singleton, the only Class 8 locomotive built by British Railways, the only multi-cylinder BR standard locomotive, and the only one of her class. Here we see her alongside Britannia at Carnforth on the only occasion the two locomotives have met in preservation. After a prolonged restoration, which broke new records in almost every sphere, especially in having complete new cylinders, valve gear, and coupling and connecting rods built, the indefatigable 71,000 Duke of Gloucester Steam Locomotive Trust took on British Rail to persuade them to allow the Duke to run on BR metals. They'd overcome every other obstacle, so of course they succeeded here as well. And we see her on BR's compulsory test run from Derby. 14-coach load was set to test the locomotive, and she succeeded with ease, recording well in excess of 80 miles an hour on the return run. Her first public runs were eagerly anticipated and were instant sellouts, resulting in an additional tour being organized. These runs were diagrammed from Marylebone or Didcot, the second one running to Nottingham whilst the others ran to Derby. She was next exercised on the Welsh marches. The general public, rather than enthusiasts, were the next to have the honour of royalty at the head of their train. The Duke was the star turner on British Rail's second season of North Wales Coast Expresses. The North Wales Coast Expresses ran for 3 full seasons, but the recession meant that the 3rd season didn't cover its costs, so 1992 saw a very curtailed programme of runs. The Duke takes us back to the happier times. The autumn of 1990 was the first time the locomotive worked on the Settle and Carlisle, and as always, the mere presence of the locomotive guaranteed full trains. The engine remained in the north throughout the early winter of 1990, with cold weather ensuring plenty of atmospheric smoke. She returned to Crewe at the turn of the year to work a series of winter trains to Holyhead, the terminus of the North Wales Coast trains. The winter trains didn't go to Llandudno and were known as the Ynys Môn Express. The diesel behind the engine is dubbed ethyl and is there purely to heat the coaches. It was to become redundant within 2 months. The preserved engine is a far better machine than the solitary BR Class 8P was in service. It had a very poor reputation as a bad steamer and was compared unfavourably with the Britannia Duchesses with which it worked. The Preservation Society has discovered certain discrepancies in the drawings of the locomotive when compared to the actual machine, and during the restoration corrected these. She certainly isn't shy of steam today. In 1991 saw a series of trains from Didcot to Stratford. The engine is based at the Didcot shed of the Great Western Society, where she's an honourable alien amongst the Great Western locomotives with which it shares quarters. The Maybank holiday saw the Duke on a special series of trains in association with King Edward I from Didcot to Stratford. Our final view of this superb achievement in preservation shows her on her way to another accolade. She was invited to be displayed at the National Railway Museum at York on the occasion of its reopening in 1992, the only privately owned machine ever to have been shown there. Although a number of the Class 5 460s have been preserved, only one has worked, and then only for a short while. By comparison, the smaller Class 4 460s are numerous, and 4 have worked in the second age of steam. Not strictly an express locomotive, some of the class were painted in express passenger line green livery by the Western region, so they can help illustrate the look of the British Express steam locomotive. Number 75029 was bought by the artist David Shepherd, direct from BR at the end of steam, and now rejoices in the name The Green Knight. Returning tender first, the engine displays the reason for the shape of its tender. The inset coal bunker allowed good rearward vision, as these locomotives were intended for use on secondary lines. The secondary line, which is best associated with the class, is the Cambrian main line, over which the Cambrian Coast Express ran. The Class 4s were used on this named train, and in 1991, British Rail recalled the great days of the Cambrian with a series of Cambrian Limited trains. Barmouth Bridge looks good from any angle, and number 75069 was at home here. She looked like a real express locomotive on these workings. This is the best known part of the inland route, the climb to Lurthich. At Shrewsbury, she received an ovation from her well-satisfied patrons. Her return from Shrewsbury to her home base on the Severn Valley Railway was used to celebrate the 85th birthday of a well-known railway character, W.A. Camwell. Only one of the preserved Class 4s wears the original line black livery, which British Railways use for mixed traffic or secondary express passenger locomotives. This is the Keighley and Worth Valley Railway's 75078, which is seen when on loan to the East Lancashire Railway. Here she's working hard at burrs and looks like an express engine. Also not an express passenger locomotive is a BR Class 9F heavy freight engine. But as we've seen in the archives, they were used on expresses, most notably the Pines Express on the Somerset and Dorset Railway. This engine put paid to all theories and actually worked the very last Pines Express of all. She's also the very last built British mainline steam engine of all, Evening Star. Here she works again in Somerset on the West Somerset Railway. Reliving the great days of the Pines Express, number 9220 was on special loan to the railway. She was built in 1960 and released to traffic with a name, the only one of her class to be so honoured and resplendent in lined express passenger green livery. The unique machine is, of course, a member of the National Railway Museum's collection. As the last steam locomotive for British Railways, she was a museum piece before she was even built. Our final views are of the engine working from its home base of York to Scarborough. Appropriately, British Railways' last locomotive is also ours.